join us today. And to let you know, the cybersecurity track is sponsored by Dell Technologies, so we thank them for that. We're joined today by Michelle Reed and Paul Coggins. My name is Subrata Saha, and I'm a corporate attorney in this space. I'm the track captain for the cybersecurity track. I'll be hosting all the sessions for this track, so feel free to ask me any questions if you have any. But right now, we're talking about the evolving cybersecurity regulatory framework with Michelle and Paul. That being said, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Michelle and let the speakers introduce themselves.
Hi, thanks for joining today. And thanks for your patience with all of our technical issues. That we may be cybersecurity lawyers, but sometimes the technical issues get us too. I am a partner at the law firm of Aiken Gump, and I co-lead our firm's cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection practice. And what that means is that I am there for when you are in crisis, usually. And so I tell people, if you have a crisis and it has something to do with cybersecurity or privacy, I'm the one who's usually helping you walk through that and hopefully allay concerns and get you through with as little damage as possible. I have been doing this for many years now, and I help companies from the beginning all the way through to the end. So from helping them people have an issue, have a breach, I help them with the breach and help them figure out who they need to notify, which attorneys general they need to know what happened, help them with public relations. We usually set them up with public relations and with the forensics behind it, and then ultimately handling the litigation that often follows. So depending on what stage you meet me at, you either associate me with lots of stress or hopefully lots of preventative. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Michelle. Paul?
Yes, I'm Paul Coggins, and I'm sorry I can't share my video with you. We're still working that bug out, but I'm happy to be with you. I am currently the co-chair of the White Collar and Government Investigation section of Lock Lord. I have previously, and unlike Michelle, I'm not a hard cyber guy. I do a lot of document production. I do a lot of work with the feds having to do with cybersecurity issues and cybersecurity cases. And prior to that, I was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, where I set up the second cybercrime task force in a local U.S. Attorney's office, patterned after the one in San Diego, and was instrumental in getting the Regional Computer Forensic Lab located in Dallas, Texas, and it serves a large area of the country, the second largest lab of its kind, the largest outside Washington, D.C. And I've got to get a plug in for my book. I'm an author, and my newest book, Sting Like a Butterfly, was released a couple of months ago, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So support a struggling artist.
And is that fiction or nonfiction, or?
It's fiction. I've published 2 fiction books and 1 nonfiction book. So, and I've gotten my third fiction book's been picked up by the publisher for next year.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that.
There's life after law.
Oh, wow. That's good to hear, especially. So let's get started. So, one of the big concerns, that a lot of governmental agencies are having are, privacy concerns and cybersecurity concerns. Are there any regulations that are upcoming that you'd like to highlight or discuss or, talk about or have any thoughts on?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the one that most people in the United States are grappling with right now is the Ccpa, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that law is both has breach components to it, data breach components to it, and then privacy law components to it. And it is the most comprehensive privacy law that is passed in the United States anywhere. And it has caused a whole lot of compliance headaches for companies all across the nation. And in fact, it became law as of January 1st of this year, but they just released the final regulations in the past 2 weeks. And they, in fact, even began enforcement of the law before they released the final regulations. And so what this law does is it creates different kind of rights that you've probably heard of: the right to be forgotten, the right to have your data and know what data you have, the right to tell someone not to sell your data, the right to not be discriminated against for telling someone that you're exercising your privacy rights and not wanting them to sell or share your data. And there's a whole host of requirements that are associated with the California Consumer Privacy Act. And so companies all over are trying to grapple with that and figure out how to establish these privacy controls in place and these cybersecurity controls in place so that they can comply with this law. And if that wasn't enough, then because Ccpa is so new and literally just got the regulations passed, one of our good friends, his name is Alistair McTaggart, who is the one who is the brains behind the Ccpa to begin with, decided that it really wasn't comprehensive enough. And so he initiated a new referendum process in California that is, at least right now, predicted to pass. And the CPRA is likely going to come into effect, which has an even more comprehensive privacy regulation. So as of 2020, so far, 3 states have implemented unique privacy laws, 5 states have created task force, and 17 states have introduced legislation in either 2019 or 2020. All 50 states and the US territories have implemented data breach notification requirements, and there's 18 new state laws in the last 2 years that have expanded data breach obligations. So lots of different laws and lots of different things for companies to think about as we venture through this new world of data privacy.
Let me just follow up, and I think Michelle's given an excellent argument for why it's well past time for the House and the Senate to pass a comprehensive law, because with globalization, with the fact that you're starting, your startup, I'm sure you don't intend it to just operate in one state. It's going to cross state lines almost inevitably. A patchwork system with 50 different laws might be a boon to the legal community, because you're going to want to have to comply probably with the strictest, but you're going to have a patchwork of compliance. I think it's crazy for the United States not to look at a national compliance system, and I think that's inevitable at some point.
Okay, and so right now, how closely should Dallas startups or Texas startups pay attention to this California regulation, and what are your suggestions regarding that? I'm sorry?
Yeah, the problem with it is if you don't, first of all, you've got to take a look at where the trend is leading. And the United States, there's an interesting study that came out that KPMG did, just released it this year. And it was a study of consumers. And so when you're looking at a startup and you're thinking about how you're going to plan for the future, how you're going to differentiate yourself from your customers. This KPMG study was called New Imperative for Corporate Data Responsibility. And what it showed was 97% of the American public thought data privacy wasn't important to them. 56% want more control over their data. 68%, almost 70%, don't trust companies to do the ethical and right thing in terms of holding on to data. A majority don't trust companies to protect their personal data. So you can see there is a lot. When Michelle talks about a referendum in California, there is fear among consumers, and that's something that companies, old companies, new companies, startups, established companies are going to have to grapple with. I know it's tough when you do a startup, but you're going to have to think about what the regulatory system is going to look like 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And it's not likely to be laxer. It's likely to anything, be tighter And we have to look at not just California, but frankly, what Europe's done with data privacy and data protection, because that may well be, depending upon what the administration is next year, closer to what we see.
So how do startups that are cash strapped, and this is one of the questions that's kind of discussed in the chat right here, is how do these startups keep costs down and still comply with these regulations? Should they just go with the most strict regulation and just follow that, or what is your suggestion here?
Should I?
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul. You know.
Well, number one, I mean, one of the issues we've talked about and you've asked us to talk about is, and it's broader than sort of data protection. It's compliance. And startups are like every other company. They've got to comply with a panoply of laws, including privacy restrictions, including data protection laws, those kind of things. It falls within the penumbra of compliance. And so the most important thing I think for a startup to do is to assess the risk. And startup's such a broad term, because the risks are different, whether you're a healthcare company, whether you're some kind of a defense company. There are all sorts of different kinds of startups and different compliance and risk areas. And so what you really have to do is do the most realistic assessment of what are the risks. And after you determine those risks, how can you mitigate them? How can you eliminate them? The ones you can't eliminate, how do you mitigate? And the ones you can't mitigate or mitigate, but still would break the company, how do you pass that risk on, perhaps through insurance or otherwise? So, I think it starts with assessing your risk and and that risk is going to change over time. The bigger you are, the more, in general, for example, government agencies are going to expect you to have greater, more robust compliance procedures. So your compliance procedures have to be good when you start out, and they have to get better over time, and more comprehensive over time, and revised over time, frankly.
I agree with that. I guess where I would start if I were a new business is the way you can do anything with privacy or anything with cybersecurity is by understanding your data flows. What data do you have? And whether that's personal data, whether it's intellectual property that you care about, whether it's a trading algorithm that you care about, whatever it is that you care about, sort of think of it as your crown jewels, and then add personal data to that mix. You may not think of personal data as your crown. Are going forward. There's an organization called NIST that has a cybersecurity framework, and then in the last year and a half has come out with a privacy framework. It is a scalable framework that can be used by any company, and I would highly recommend taking a look at it because it enables you to think about your controls in a very specific way. And it's scalable, so it doesn't expect that you are going to have the controls that, for example, IBM would have, right? You're going to have the controls that fit the size of your company, but some basics like password hygiene and, making sure you understand your data and that you're not over retaining data, that you're deleting data, that you have permissions to use the data that you have. Some of those basic principles are not costly. It really is more of a matter of planning than it is of an expense.
So planning is important here, as always. And okay, so we have a question here. Cynthia asks, and maybe you can maybe guide to a resource. Where do we find a list of the state laws that I think Paul was referring to? Is there a resource for that?
Yes, so there's several different resources. There's I think it's the National Association of State Legislators has a listing of all of the data breach notification laws. And the privacy laws are a lot trickier. I can kind of tell you right now, California, if you take California and you use California as your base, you're going to have your bases covered for the United States. On the cybersecurity side, I would look really heavily at New York and at Massachusetts. And if you just Google New York cybersecurity law, it's gonna pull up for you. And they actually have a lot of really helpful FAQs about what the law means and what you have to do, depending on where you are.
Yeah, and one thing, in terms of what a company can do at the outset, as I said, the important thing, and Michelle pointed out, you have valuable information. How are you going to protect that? And who's going to basically be the security expert that advises you, whether that's a security expert that's part of your team, somebody that works with you? Is it a security expert that you bring in, as a consultant to assist you? I work with a fantastic number, while I was U.S. Attorney, of federal agents, both at the FBI and other agencies. And what a lot of those guys rolled out to do after they left the Bureau was become security experts for companies. Now, often it would be well-established companies as opposed to startups, but even if you didn't have one of these folks on your team, you might want to have one of these folks as a consultant that you could reach out to, not just to talk about maybe sometimes the data protection laws, the privacy laws that you're going to have to really grapple with on a daily basis, but also what kind of attacks we're seeing. Michelle's in a big law firm. I'm in a big law firm. We sort of have something that I try to pay attention to called the fish of the day. And it's basically who's trolling for your document and how are they trying to get to you now? I mean, as sort of a tip for folks to be careful about. Because I can speak to you not only as an attorney, not only as a former federal prosecutor, but as a victim. Our law firm was victimized by an unhappy person who had been let go in the IT department, and he shut down our internet. It became quite an incident. One we reported to law enforcement, one that law enforcement took quite seriously. So, when you say, what can you do at the outset? And this is true whether you're a startup, whatever kind of company you are, vet your people carefully. Make sure you vet folks very carefully before you let them in the door, because you got a lot of valuable assets. You won't catch everyone, but you'll catch some.
This is perhaps more of a that's interesting that how much the law firms are targeted there. No surprise there though.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is that startups have, and it's such a competitive environment. How does your startup compete with those that don't follow the rules? And this is perhaps more of a business question than a legal question. But any input on that?
Yeah, I'll jump at that, because I will just tell you, having watched companies, some of which, grew and prospered, and many of which fell by the wayside, and some of which actually winded up either civilly or criminally liable in some of these instances. It may be a temptation to not take the kind of protective measures to cut cost here. I read you that report from KPMG. I think that's a bad way to start your business, and it's probably not going to end well if it happens like that. I will also tell you there's another story that plays out time and time again in companies that I represent that are dealing with law enforcement issues, and that is they have an adequate setup or an adequate compliance apparatus when they start as sort of a mom and pop or a very small startup. They grow, and their compliance and their security procedures don't grow with the firm. They simply grow too fast, too soon, and their compliance procedures don't go along with them. And while that may be cost effective in the short run, it is almost always disastrous in the long run.
So you mentioned that that it's kind of a growth. You grow with this. When should startups get cybersecurity insurance? Is that a big deal? What are your thoughts on that?
Cyber insurance, it really depends on what price point you're at and what industry you're at. The cyber insurance is as good as you pay for it, and all the policies are totally different. So if you get a different product, like a D&O product, or just your CGL or commercial general liability products, they all have standard forms that have developed over the years and have been interpreted over the years. The privacy and the cyber forms are not there. So every insurer has its own form, and every insurer insures differently. Generally speaking, they've been construed very broadly, but one of the biggest risk areas, I think, especially for smaller companies that are in the startup stage, is wire transfer fraud that is committed through a data breach. And that wire transfer fraud, almost all the insurers have made it so that that they've put the limit so low that it almost makes it not particularly valuable, because they sublimit the policy. So even if let's say you got giant policy, let's say you got a $5-10 million policy, which would be a good size policy for a company, depending on what your value is. But most of them are sublimited to $250,000 for wire transfer frauds. And that's a huge issue. And the wire transfer frauds that have been occurring to the tune of millions of dollars, even for small companies. And so my recommendation on cyber insurance would be that you look at what you're getting. Sometimes you can get it through a CGL policy if you're a small company, a commercial general liability policy. You have to negotiate for it, but sometimes you can get it. And that's actually a good deal, because they have panel providers that provide notice letters, and that provide the 1-800 number, and that provide the credit monitoring that happen if you have a data breach. And so that can give you really good value, because it gives you lower costs for all of that, and it gives you some coverage for it. But once you start hitting the big policy numbers, depending on what your size is, you hit this sort of world where sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not. And so you have to really look at kind of what your position is. How many data points do you have? So how big would that notice be, or how much harm would suffer? And is it even covered under the policy? That's the balance.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, because I think Michelle hit on a couple of very, very important points for a startup. First of all, you are going to your risk assessment will sort of mirror your desire for insurance. I mentioned the 2020 study by KPMG. Everybody does a study. There's a 2020 study by IBM on cost of the data breach. They surveyed a number of different data breaches, and what they found was the average data breach cost a company about $3.8 million, and took the company a couple of hundred days to fix and to get back to normal. So this shows you that even a policy, and Michelle's absolutely right, if there's ever an area where you're probably going to want to get somebody to weigh in and take a look at the insurance policies, the good news is there's just a number of policies out there now. I mean, it's a booming business. There are a lot of policies. Some are good, some are terrible, and there's a lot in between. But I have to deal with insurance policies every day. I hate them. So we have insurance experts. So the first thing I do is call in one of our insurance experts and tell me, is it a good policy, a bad policy? What triggers coverage? Because one of the things you're going to find is, even if you're not the target, you may have to respond to subpoenas in civil cases and administrative cases. In other cases, is it triggered by a subpoena? What are the exclusions? And just like I keep telling you, you have to revise and upgrade your general compliance procedures. Same with insurance. You ought to try to, on a regular basis, say, do we have enough insurance? Are we actually covering the risk that we face? And is the current policy we have the policy we need? at this point in time, because it will change over time. And the insurance companies, they're clever about excluding things. So you just got to figure, am I getting my dollars worth here?
I like that the insurance companies are clever about this.
Look, they're going to cover the zombie apocalypse. They may not cover Hurricane Laura.
That's funny. I'd like to jump back a little bit to the regulations. Particularly, I'd like to discuss GDPR. We've seen it in place for a few years now. What are your thoughts on this, how that's going, and just the general progress of it, and is it working or is it not?
Well, that's a great question. I think GDPR is working only because it caused companies all around the world to take privacy seriously. Before GDPR and before that giant hammer of 2% of the worldwide revenue that you could be penalized, this was sort of a not even the tail of the dog. It was like a flea on the dog issue, because there was no financial harm that would come to a company, generally speaking, if they did something wrong. In the United States, the primary federal regulator is the FTC, and the FTC doesn't even really have authority to give you a penalty the first round. They give you a penalty the second round. So if you make a mistake once, you get put under an undertaking. If you get a mistake twice, that's when their penalties come into play. And so companies didn't take privacy very seriously. GDPR changed that because it changed the financial calculus. And you see giant fines. If you look at the Marriott fine coming out of Europe, you can see some really, and British Airways, those big fines coming out of Europe now. And so I think companies are taking it seriously, and they put in compliance programs where they didn't even have compliance programs before. So I do think GDPR has done a sea change. Also made a huge change in Europe, because whereas in the United States, we're kind of the wild west of data. We use it however we want, and generally you don't even have to ask permission and you can use it. It's obviously changing now with the Ccpa, but that's how it was. In Europe, it was exactly the opposite. Privacy was a treasured value, but no one ever knew when it was breached. So no one ever got notice in Europe prior to the advent of the GDPR. And so now with GDPR, Europeans are realizing, whoa, I guess people weren't so careful with our data, because there are notices, hundreds of notices every day going to regulators all across Europe. And so I think it's changed attitudes. I think it's changed compliance programs, and it's certainly changed the way businesses think about privacy and cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I would just like to, historically say, GDPR came into effect a couple of years ago, and there are many who think that had a major impact on Ccpa being enacted in California. I also think that just like the advice has been sort of, you have to take into account Ccpa, not only because that's where the major tech companies are, that California is obviously a huge market. Same with GDPR. I mean, it's, with globalization being what it is, it's almost the case that the tightest security is going to perhaps win out in the end, because companies are going to have to, in most cases, maybe you have a startup that's different, but most startups want to be grow big and go global. You're going to have to take into account the tightest security out there, and that's GDPR, and they are the pioneers in this field.
And so how do you feel that that compares to the California regulations? Do you think the California regulations are not taking it the right way, or because it sounds like you do like the GDPR regulations?
I think California regulations were a step in the right directions. I think we're probably going to end up with some, in the United States with a national framework. Maybe I'm being overly, optimistic here, but I mean, I just think the 50-state framework is unworkable in this day and age, and we owe it to companies to give them the clearest possible guidance. I mean, the one thing that's not fair is to penalize companies greatly because they can't keep up with 60 different frameworks or something like that. So I think a national framework is important. I think it'll ultimately be maybe kind of a merger or close to what Ccpa and Gdpr at the end of the day will be. I don't know when that'll come. It probably depends upon, the administration we have and how close that administration feels tied to Europe and to NATO and things like that. So all that sort of militates in my mind toward, using GDPR as the touchstone. But
do you believe that these? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the only thing I would say there is, we're looking at startup companies, and competition is really important. In the United States, you can use data in a way that you cannot use data in Europe, even with the CCPA, because it is not quite as broad as the GDPR. And so I think you really need to look at your compliance framework and evaluate what you want to do with data. If you're not a super data heavy company, then probably go with the GDPR framework and do what you want. But there's a lot of value in data, and I'm talking some of my companies that I work with. I mean, millions and millions and millions of dollars of data. I had a ransomware breach where they were losing millions of dollars a day by having their data tied up. And so it's easy to say, go with the most restrictive regime, and then you'll always be compliant, which is true. If you go with the most restrictive regime and you go with the European standard, even in the United States, you're going to comply with everything. But you're also going to leave a competitive advantage on the table that maybe you don't want to leave on the table just yet. We may end up there if we end up with a 50-state CPRA type program, if CPRA comes into play and things like that happen. But until we get there, there's a pretty significant value to data, and there are differences that I think companies should be mindful of. But then there's some things, for example, like your cookie policy, where it's maybe easier to just use a broad cookie policy in the way you track online behavior versus the way you track consumer behavior, depending on what your business is.
Okay. So, we have just a few minutes here, and I think Hopin will kick us out at 10:45. I think it'll just stop the chat. So do you have any tips that for startups? Any thoughts? What are some? Can you give some guidance? Maybe some free legal help right now, as far as what startups should do moving forward over the next couple of years.
Paul, do you want to start, or do you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle, and I'll follow up. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if I had advice, my advice is this: know your data and know your data flows. Know exactly where it is and know who's sharing it. Number two, protect your data. And by that, I mean, most of the breaches that happen are because someone made a really silly mistake and they provided access where they shouldn't provide access. And so if you have a choice, if I could give you one technical solution that I would highly recommend every company has, even if it costs you extra, which it does, it's two-factor authentication on your email. You can save yourself millions of dollars in expense by having two-factor authentication on your email. So take some of those things, those basic password hygiene, two-factor authentication, minimizing your data where you can, and getting rid of data that you don't need to have. Those are the types of things that ultimately will save you big bucks in the long run.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to what Michelle said is take your training seriously. Most failures are human failures, and people make mistakes. People get careless over time. You can obviously you're gonna have to train and upgrade that training and continue that training over time and hone into them how important that security is. We often see where there's a breach, companies get serious, they get religion for a while, and the training is great for a while. They hire security analysts for a while. And then as time goes by, people get sloppy again, money gets diverted to other departments. So it's one of those things that it's ongoing. I would also look out there. There are sort of, there are like-minded people in your industry, and there are probably opportunities for you to go to school on what's happened to other startups and other companies. And most lawyers who handle these kind of things, like Michelle and people like that, will have all sorts of war stories about, startups that prospered and startups that floundered because they didn't do the right thing. Look for those security experts. As I said, I just tend to hire folks out of the FBI and IRS because I worked with them. I know them. I worked with them when we set up our cybersecurity task forces back in the past. They're rolling out of the government. They're available, and if you can't afford to hire them as your company, you can often hire them as security analysts to help you assess the risk to your data.
Some good points there. So we're about out of time. I just want to thank the speakers. It was really informative. Thank you so much, Paul and Michelle, for joining us. It was a pleasure hearing from both of you. And thank you to all the attendees that came. We hope to hear from you soon. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.